One of the most common mistakes I see when people deadlift, when they lunge, or when they're doing any type of hip extension exercise is they extend their knee, not their hip. I'm Alex Effer from Resilient Training and Rehab, and I've helped thousands of practitioners and people from around the world get more consistent and faster results with their clients. Today, we're going to be talking about hip extension as it associates with what's happening at the pelvis, so the mechanics of the hip. We're going to be talking about common compensations when it comes to hip extension. We're going to be talking about why we should be thinking about the hip moving around the knee versus the knee extending first and then the hip extending. And then we're going to talk about two different exercises in order to improve these mechanics. So when we're talking about hip extension, it's important to understand the mechanics of how that happens so that we can program and assess specific things in order to identify where there's limitation and how to program for it. So when we're looking at the pelvis, especially as it associates with hip extension, there are a couple key areas we need to focus on. In order to extend the hip, we need to make sure, or what has to happen is the sacrum actually has to tilt forward and nutate. So basically, the sacrum has to move away from the sit bone. So as I do any type of hinging, for example, I'm going to need initially the sacrum to be able to nutate. That is going to allow me to have the space for my femur to be able to move back into the socket. So for example, you'll often see people do some type of sideline hip extension measurement where they're getting people to lay on their side, and you will manually take the femur back into hip extension. But what you'll often see is if they don't have that ability to nutate the sacrum or have the space back there, maybe because the glutes are very tense or a lot of these muscles back here are very tense, then what's going to happen is they are actually going to arch their lower back as you start to move them into that hip extension. So when we want to extend the hip, we're going to want this space to stay open. We're also going to initially want the hip to stay in a hip internally rotated position. So when I am extending the hip, so if I take a step forward, for example, my femur is going to internally rotate. As this hip comes through, what I'm going to want to happen is my pelvis is going to actually turn away from this femur. That's how we extend our hip. And in order to do so, I'm going to need this femur to be able to stay in an internally rotated position so that the pelvis can move around it. So this is a lot of biomechanical explanation just to discuss what should be happening at the pelvis. So when we're programming exercises, we understand where we're targeting. And so we really want to be focusing on making sure this space opens and stays open. We also want to make sure that the femur is initially in an internally rotated position, because if the femur is externally rotated, then this back part of the femur and the sit bone, which is called your posterior capsule, is closed, and then I have to get the extension from my lower back or my knee instead. So we want to first make sure that the femur can internally rotate. We want to make sure that the space between the sacrum and the sit bone also stays open so that we can move effectively. So a common compensation that I see when it comes to the inability to extend the hip is a lot of people, especially when they're doing some type of hinge, they're actually going to extend their knee before they extend their hip. So they'll do a movement, something like this, where their knee slams back, then their hips come through, okay? This is going to be very similar to what I discussed with that femur being in externally rotated position, because they can't get the extension from their hip, so they're going to try to hyperextend their knee in order to make up for it. They may still feel a little bit of glute working, but it's not actually improving or addressing or even accomplishing the hip extension mechanics that we're looking for. Additionally, we can also see people who extend their lower back, especially as they're doing some type of deadlift. As they come up, they arch their lower back, then their hips come through, right? Again, that's kind of similar to the knee hyperextending before the hip goes through. The back is going to extend before our hip extends. And so what we really want to be thinking about when it comes to programming exercises is we want to start to think about delaying the knee extension so that pelvis moves around the knee versus the knee going back first and then the pelvis forward. So I want to keep this knee in place so that the pelvis can move around it, and that's going to ensure that I'm not using my back and I'm using the right hip musculature in order to accomplish that movement. So when we're really trying to reinforce this knee staying stable or knee staying flexed as the hip extends, one of my favorite ways to do this is actually teaching somebody more of a knee-based hip extension. Is actually using this kickstand position in order to facilitate that hip extension without the knee slamming back. So what I get people to do is, if they really need a regression, I like to put a foam roller against the wall in order to create this type of hip extension and keeping the knee flexed. But a progression of this would be just starting in a staggered stance position. So essentially, I've got my foot forward, I've got my knee bent, so it's in line with the knuckles of the toes. Okay, so it's in line with the knuckles of the toes. And I have the balls of my toes on the back foot planted into the ground. So I'm going to keep this knee forward. I'm going to hold the dumbbell in the opposite hand. And what I'm going to do is, staying heel heavy on this right side, I'm going to keep the knee forward as I fold over, as I bend over. So I'm going to feel the weight, want to go towards my toes, but I'm going to keep that heel locked in. As I come up, I'm going to drive the knee forward and have the hip come forward, versus having the knee go back as the hip goes forward. So what I'm going to do again, knee goes towards the knuckles, I'm going to fold over, knee drives forward, hip drives forward. Keep the knee where it is, fold over, think about the sit bone going up towards the ceiling, and then I'm going to drive forward. And I'm going to really make sure I keep that heel heavy so I keep all the pressure in my glute. If I move towards my toes, then I might not feel as much in my glutes. That heel is my ability to access my hamstring to keep my sit bone in a position to not allow my back to be able to compensate. For the second exercise, we're going to be doing a rear foot elevated split squat with an ipsilateral hold. Ipsilateral just means I'm going to be holding the dumbbell in the same side as the leg that's forward. So in this case, I did the right rear foot elevated split squat with an ipsilateral hold. By intuitively lifting up my back leg and putting it on the bench, that's going to cause my center of gravity to shift forward onto that front leg. So just think that 80% of my body weight is now on that front leg, 20% is on the back leg. It could even be 90-10, but by putting more force onto that front leg in this case, I'm going to be required to produce that much more force just to be able to stand up. So as opposed to something like a front foot elevated split squat, this rear foot elevated split squat is really going to be maximizing force output, which is very important for hip extension. The other thing to consider is that in this rear foot elevated split squat, I'm not really extending my knee, I'm keeping my knee flexed. So this is going to challenge hip extension from a hip flex position, which is going to be really good for keeping the back part of that pelvis open. So what I'm going to be thinking about in this movement is I'm going to be thinking about tilting forward slightly, but again, so my body feels like it's going towards his toes, but I'm going to lock down that heel, keeping heel heavy. I'm going to hold the dumbbell in that right side. As I go down, I'm thinking about driving that knee forward as my hip just goes straight down. I'm not driving the knee forward and letting the hip go with it. I'm driving the knee forward and the hip goes straight down. As I come up, I'm thinking about pressing on that inside edge of the foot. And as I come up, what you may feel like your hips want to turn away from that side. Try not to allow them to turn excessively, but because you're holding the dumbbell on that side, that's what's going to happen. Because I've got more weight on that right leg, I'm going to have to put more force into the ground, and it's going to cause my pelvis to want to turn away from that leg, which is an important mechanism for hip extension. So remember, we are going to be driving the knee forward as our hip goes straight down. We're going to hinge over slightly at all times, and we're going to be thinking about pressing on that inside edge of the foot while also keeping heel heavy. In this video, we discussed hip extension and some of the common mistakes that people make when it comes to hip extension, specifically extending the back or extending the knees too early and not allowing the hip to actually create that hip extension. We also talked about the mechanics of hip extension, and we talked about 2 different exercises that are meant to reinforce hip extension through the right way without, again, hyperextending the knee or extending the lower back. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more videos like this, and let me know how the exercises go.